This is us. This is us. I've been a SR officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you'll find interesting. I have a pretty good track record of finding missing people. More often than not, they just wander off the trail or slide off a small cliff and can't find their way back. Most of them have heard the old "stay where you are" and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 occasions where this didn't happen. Both of these things really concern me, and I use them as motivation to pursue even more active missing persons cases that challenge me. The first was a little boy who was picking berries with his parents. He and his sister were together and went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, during which time both children apparently simply wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us and we went out to search the area. We found our daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked her where her brother was, she told us that a bear had taken him. She said he gave her berries and told her to be quiet, that he wanted her to play with her brother for a while. And the last time she saw her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of a bear man, looking calm. Of course, our first thought was kidnapping, but we never found any sign of another person in the area, and the little girl also insisted that he was not a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a strange face. We've been searching the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found any trace of that cue. The second was a young woman who was camping with her mother and grandfather. According to the mother, her daughter climbed a tree to get a better view of the forest and never came down. They waited for hours at the foot of the tree, calling her name, before calling for help. Again, we looked everywhere and we found no sign of her. I have no idea where she could have gone because neither mother nor grandfather saw her go down. Several times I went on my own quest with the dog, and they tried to lead me up the steep cliffs. Not hills or even cliffs, but straight sheer cliffs with no possible grabs. It is always disconcerting, and in such cases, we usually find the man on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the dog led us. I'm sure there's an explanation somewhere, but it's very strange. One sad case is related to the recovery of the body. A 9-year-old girl fell on the embankment and stabbed herself on a dry tree at the foot. It was a complete accident, but I'll never forget the sound of her mother's voice when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance and let out the most haunting and heartbreaking wail I've ever heard. It was as if her whole life was collapsing around her, and a part of her died with her daughter. I heard from another SR officer that she took her own life a few weeks after it happened. She just couldn't get over the loss of her daughter. Another time I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we had received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who didn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we were supposed to be. We found him trapped in a small crevice with a broken leg, and it wasn't very pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and the leg was clearly infected. We were able to get him into the helicopter, and I heard from one of the EMS that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he was fine, and when he got to the top, there was a man. According to him, the guy did not have mountaineering equipment. He was wearing a parka and ski pants. He approached the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said that he didn't have a face. It was just empty, and he freaked out and tried to drive off the mountain too fast, so he fell. He said he heard a guy coming down the mountain all night making these horrible muffled screams, and the story really sickened me, and I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things that ever happened to me was searching for a young woman who got separated from a tour group. We were out until late at night because the dogs smelled her. When we found her, she was curled up under a large, rotten log. She had no shoes or backpack and was clearly in shock. There was no damage to her, and we were able to just walk her back to ops with us. On the way, she kept looking behind us and asking why this big man with black eyes was following us. Obviously, we didn't see anyone, so we just chalked it up to some weird shock symptom. But the closer we got to the base, the more worried this woman became. She kept begging me to tell him to stop making faces at her, and at one point she stopped, turned, and started yelling into the woods, saying she wanted him to leave her alone. She said she wasn't going to go with him, and she wasn't going to give us to him either. We finally got her to move, but we started hearing these very strange noises from everywhere. It was almost like a cough, but more rhythmic and deep. It was almost like an insect. I don't really know how else to describe it other than this, but when we got inside the base, the woman turned to me and her eyes were so wide I can only imagine being opened by a human. Then she touches my shoulder and says, "He's telling you to hurry up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I now have a very small scar on my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how that woman saw it. And right after she says that, I hear this weird cough right in my ear, and I almost jumped out of my skin. Well, I pushed her to the ROPS, trying not to show how mad I was. But I have to say, I was very happy when we left the area that night. The following is probably one of the weirdest stories I have. I don't know if this is the case in every traffic police unit, but in mine it is an unspoken common thing that we deal with. You can try asking other traffic police officers about it, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. In fact, we were told not to talk about it with our superiors, and by now we're all so used to it that it doesn't seem strange anymore. So, almost every time we're very far out in the desert, I say 30 or 40 miles down, at some point we're going to find a ladder in the middle of the forest. It's almost like if you looked at a staircase in your house, just cut it out and put it in the woods. I asked about it the first time I saw them, and the officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked about it also said the same thing, and I wanted to go check them out, but was told very strongly that I should never go near them. I just ignore them now when I run into them because, well, it happens so often. Anyway, as far as missing people go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The rest are rescue calls. Fire injures people who fell off the rocks and injured themselves. You wouldn't believe how often this happens. Mostly drunk kids, mind you. They are bitten or stung by animals or insects. We are a tight-knit team, and we have veterans who are great at tracking down lost people. And that's what makes the times when we never find a trace of them so frustrating. One in particular upset us all because we found their trail, but it led to more questions than answers. An elderly man was walking alone on a paved path, but his wife called and said he didn't come home when he was supposed to. Apparently he had seizures before, and she was worried that he was off his meds and got one in the investigation. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone and why she didn't go with him. I just don't ask about things like that because after a certain point it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing and it's my job to find him. So we went on a standard search, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found a sign that the guy was off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, fanning out to make sure we covered as much ground as possible. All of a sudden there's a call on the radio to get back to the vet, and we get there immediately because that usually means the missing person is injured and we need a full team to help them get out safely. We meet back and the vet is just standing at the base of the tree with his hands on the sides of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and he points to the branches of this tree. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, but here was a cane hanging from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap on the handle was wrapped around the branch and just hanging. There's no way the guy would have thrown it that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's still in the area. We go to the tree, but it is clear that there is no one on it. We all just scratch the back of our heads and keep looking for a guy, but we never find one. We even bring out our fangs, but they lose their scent long before this tree. Eventually, the seekers just stopped, because there are other challenges we have to attend to, and there's not much we can do after a certain point. This guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we had found her husband, and it really hurt to hear her getting more and more hopeless every time. I don't know why this particular call was so upsetting, but I think it was just sheer improbability. These, and perhaps the issues that have been raised. I mean, how the hell did this guy's stick end up there? Did someone kill him and throw him in there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a mockery. But we still talk about it from time to time. Without a doubt, missing children are the most heartbreaking cases. It doesn't matter under what circumstances they disappeared. It's never easy, and we always fear those we find dead. It's not often, but it happens. David Paulides talks a lot about children's SR teams finding them in places they shouldn't be or simply can't be. I can honestly say that I have heard more of these things than I have seen, but I will share one that I often think about and have personally witnessed. A mother and her 3 children were having a picnic in an area of the park where there is a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3, I think. She watches them very closely and, she says, never lets them out of her sight. She didn't see anyone else in the area either, which is important. She collects their things and they head back to the parking lot. Now this lake is only 2 miles in the woods, and it is on a very clear paved trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking lot to it, unless you intentionally go off the road like a misfit. Her children go before her when she hears sounds as if someone is walking behind her on the path. She turns, and about 4 seconds later, while she's not looking, her 5-year-old son just disappears. She thinks he got off the trail to pee or something, and asks the other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the forest near them, took the child by the hand and led him into the trees. The other 2 children don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it looked like they were drugged or something. They are kind of spatial and vague, so she of course went crazy, started frantically looking for the child. She screams his name and at one point says she even thinks she heard him answer her. Now, obviously she can't run blindly into the forest. I mean, she has 2 other kids, right? So she calls the police and they send us right away. We respond and start searching for him. During this search, which spans kilometers, we simply do not find any trace of the child. The fangs pick up no scent. We find no clothes, no broken bushes, literally nothing that would indicate the presence of a child. Of course, there are suspicions about the mother for a while, but it is quite clear that she is completely destroyed by everything. We've been looking for this baby for weeks with a lot of help from volunteers, but eventually the search is over and we just have to move on. However, the volunteers continue to search, and one day we received a call on the radio saying that a body had been found and was to be found. They tell us the location and none of us believe it. We assume it must be another child, but we got out there, about 15 miles from where he disappeared, and sure enough, we found the body of the child we were looking for. I've been trying to figure out how this kid got to where he is since we found him and never found an answer. The volunteer happened to be in the area because he figured he could look in places no one would have thought of in case the body had been dumped or something. He approaches the foot of a high rocky slope, and halfway he sees something. He looks through the binoculars, and sure enough, he sees that it is the body of a small boy stuffed into a small hole in the rock. He recognizes the color of the child's shirt, so he immediately realizes that it is the missing boy. And then he calls, and we are dispatched. Even this body took us almost an hour, and none of us could believe what we saw. Not only was this guy 15 miles from where he started, but there was no way he could get up there on his own. I mean, this slope is really treacherous, and even for us with our climbing gear, it's hard to get there. A 5-year-old boy with absolutely no experience and no equipment with him. There was just no way he was ever going to get up there by himself. I am sure of that. But not only that, kid, there wasn't even a scratch on it. The shoes are gone, but the feet are not damaged or dirty. So it was not the animal that dragged him there either. And from what we can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He had been there for over a month by that point, and looked as if he had only been dead for a day or 2. The whole thing was incredibly strange, and was one of the most confusing calls I have ever received. We later learned that the coroner determined that the child had died of infection. He practically froze to death, probably late at night, 2 days before we found him. There were never any suspects or answers, and to this day, it is one of the strangest things I have ever seen. One of my first jobs as an intern was to find a 4-year-old child who had been separated from his mother. It was one of those times where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail and we could see obvious signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he was last seen. The little one did not even suspect that he had lost his way so far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad about because I'm really not good with kids, and it's hard for me to talk to them and keep them company. As the coach and I were heading back, she decided to take me on a detour to point out one of the hot spots where we usually find missing people. It's a natural dip in the ground next to a popular trail, and people usually move down because it's easier that way. So we go there, and it's a few miles, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we walk around the neighborhood and she points out places where she has found people in the past, I see something in the distance. Now the area we are in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, although there are roads that you can take closer if you don't want to go that far, but we are in a state-protected area, which means that there can be no commercial or residential development. The biggest thing you'll ever see is a fire tower or makeshift shelter that the homeless think they can get away with. But I can see from here that whatever it is, my edges are even. And if there's one thing you'll quickly learn, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, but she doesn't say anything. She just pulls away and lets me wander around and check. I get within about 20 feet of him, and all the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. This is a staircase in the middle of the forest. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing. It's just a normal staircase with a beige carpet and about 10 steps high. But instead of being in a house, where it should obviously be, it's here in the middle of the woods. Apparently, the sides are not carpeted, and I can see what wood it is made of. It's almost like a glitch in a video game, where the houses don't fully load, and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand, and it feels like my brain is working overtime to try to make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes over and stands next to me, and she just stands there casually, looking like it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what the hell this thing is doing here, and she just smiles. "Get used to it, newbie. You'll see a lot of them." I start to get closer, but she grabs my arm tightly. "I wouldn't do that," she says. Her voice is casual, but her grip is strong, and I just stand and look at her. "You'll see them here all the time, but don't go near them, okay? Don't touch them, don't climb on them, just ignore them, okay?" I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she looks at me tells me I better not. We end up moving on, and the topic just doesn't come up until the end of my training. However, she was right. I'd say about every 5th call I end up running somewhere through the stairs. Sometimes they are relatively close to the trail, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they are 20 or 30 miles away, literally in the middle of nowhere, and I only find them on extensive searches or training weekends. They are usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they have been there for a while. All different types and different sizes. The biggest ones I've ever seen looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion or something, and were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15, 20 feet. I tried to talk to some people about it, but they just gave me the same answer as my trainer. "It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're okay, but don't go near them or climb them." When listeners ask me that now, I give them the same answer. I just don't know what else to say to them. I really hope I get a better answer someday, but I have to tell you it hasn't happened yet. So this is another one that was less creepy and more sad. A young man went missing one winter, when in reality no one should have walked that far on the trails. We actually close a lot of them, but some stay open year-round unless there's a bunch of snow or something. We operated for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground, and it was an unusually heavy snow year, and we knew it was unlikely that we would find him before spring when the thaw came. And indeed, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body just off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. I immediately realized what had happened, and it scared the crap out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any amount of time on the mountain have probably guessed this too. When it snows, it doesn't collect so densely in the places under the branches. This happens most often with Christmas trees because they are shaped like a closed umbrella, and you end up with a space around the base of the tree filled with a mixture of loose powder snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious unless you know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the reception center, really big ones, to let people know how dangerous they are. Every year when we get an unusual amount of snow, At least one person doesn't read them or take the warnings seriously, and we find out in the spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and just tired or maybe cramping from walking in deep snow or something. He probably went to sit at the foot of the tree, not knowing there was a well there, and just fell down. He got stuck with his legs up and the snow fell around him. Unable to free himself, he probably just suffocated. This is called snow immersion suffocation, and it usually only happens in very deep snow. But when you're in a weird position like this guy, even 6 feet of snow can be deadly. But what scared me the most was imagining him struggling upside down in the cold. I mean, he wouldn't die soon. The snow would form a dense, heavy pile on it, and it would be literally impossible to get out. As it became harder to breathe, he would know what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in those last moments. Anyway, a lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen a goat when I've been on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, nothing like that has ever happened to me. I guess the closest thing was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where something similar happened to me, but I'm not sure I'm ready to attribute that to Kazlik or anything else. We received a report that an elderly woman had passed out on one of the trails and needed assistance to get down to the main area. We go up to where she is, and her husband is just beside himself. He's running. I think more running towards us, and tells us he's a little off the trail looking at something when his wife just starts screaming behind him. He runs to her, and she just passed out on the trail. We put her on the shield, and when we bring her down to the reception center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what the hell happened, and I can't remember exactly what she said, but basically it happened. She was waiting for her husband when she heard this really strange sound. She said it sounded like a cat, but it was somehow off. She couldn't understand why. She stepped forward a little to try to hear better, and it seemed that he was getting closer. She said the closer it got, the more uncomfortable she became until she realized what was wrong. Now I remember this next part because it was so amazing that I don't think I could forget it even if I tried. Apparently it wasn't a cat, but a human saying the word meow over and over, just meowing. But it was not a man. It couldn't be because I've never heard a man so booming in that voice. I thought my hearing aid was shutting off, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded. It was terrible. He was coming closer, but I didn't see him. And the closer he got, the more scared I got. And the last thing I remember was a figure sticking out from behind the trees. And I guess that's when I passed out. Obviously now I'm a bit confused as to why the guy in the damn forest is chanting meow meow at people. So once we get down the mountain, I tell my boss I'm going to search the area to see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead. I pick up the radio and go back to where she passed out and see no one, so I keep going for another mile or so, and when I come back I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw this guy. It's almost sunset and I have no desire to stay here alone at night, so I just write it off and make a mental note to check it again tomorrow. But as I was walking back, I began to hear something in the distance. I stop and call everyone around to name themselves. The sound didn't get any closer or louder, but it sounded exactly like a person meowing in that weird and monotonous way. As comical as it sounds, it was almost like that guy in South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I leave the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get any closer. It's also almost like from all angles. Eventually it just goes away, and I'm back at the reception center. I no longer receive such messages, and even when I returned to the area, I never heard the sound again. I guess it could have been some stupid kid just screwing with people, but even I have to admit it was pretty weird. Anyway, I wanted to get some stories that one of my friends told me, and he actually has some good ones, and I'll pass them on to you as soon as I can get them. I also have a few of my own that I think you'll enjoy, and I'll be sharing them soon, and I'm sorry to have to keep you in suspense, but hopefully these stories will make up for it and get you through the next 24 hours, until I can share the rest with them. I'll also include some of my friends' stories and see if I can find a few more people who might also have interesting things to talk about. I hope you enjoyed these stories, and I'll talk to you guys soon, but I really have to get back to work now, so yeah, until next time. So, first I'd like to answer some questions you all have. So unfortunately, I'm not comfortable talking about where exactly I work. In reality, some of the things I've mentioned here could get me in big trouble or fired, so it's best if I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I'm in the United States, and in an area that consists of a lot of desert. We're talking hundreds of miles of dense forest with a mountain range and several lakes. The latter is still of great interest, and luckily for you, a friend of mine has a story that I think you'll all be very interested in. I will cover this in more detail at the end of this update. As for whether I ever thought about asking my superiors about them, I did. But again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former bosses is no longer a SAR officer, and it is possible that he would be willing to talk to me about this. I'll talk to him later this week and let you know how it goes. As for advice on how to become a SR officer, I think the best advice I can give is to contact your local Forest Service office and see if they offer any training courses and what qualifications they have. I've been doing this for years, and I started as a volunteer just helping out with SAR operations and a lot of other things. It's a great job, despite the occasional tragic situation, of course, and I really just wouldn't want to do anything else right now. Okay, now on to the stories. First happened on a case I started handling right after I graduated and was still pretty new to it all. I was a volunteer before I took this job, like I said, so I had a basic idea of what to expect. But on these calls, you're basically dealing with finding lost people after the vets pick up on their signs and stuff. As a SAR officer, you deal with everything from animal bites to heart attacks. And in this case, an early morning call came from a young couple who were on one of the paths that go by the lake. My husband was hysterical, and we couldn't understand what was happening. We could hear a woman screaming in the background, and he was asking us to come over immediately. As we come closer, we see that he is holding his wife, and she is holding something in her hands. She screams these horrible, almost animalistic screams, and he sobs. He sees us and yells for us to help them, to please call an ambulance. Obviously, we can't just get an ambulance to the footpath now, so we ask him if his wife needs help or if she can walk on her own. He's still throwing tantrums, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife who needs help. I walk over while one of the vets is trying to calm him down and ask my wife what's going on. And she's rocking and holding something and just screaming over and over. I crouch down and see that everything she's holding is covered in blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I kind of gently open her hands to see what she's holding, and it's her baby. Apparently dead now, too. His head is sore on one side, and he is covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation really struck me. I need to gather myself for a second, and I get up and walk over to one of the vets standing by and tell him it's a dead baby, and he pats me on the shoulder and says he can handle it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to see the baby. Every time we try to take him away from her, she despairs and tells us we can't have him, that he will be fine if we just leave her alone and let her help him. But in the end, one of the vets manages to calm her down, and she gives us the body. We took him to the emergency room, but when the ambulance arrived, they told us there was no hope of saving the baby. He died immediately from the head injury. I was good friends with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital, and she told me later what happened. It turned out that the couple was walking with a baby in a sling and stopped because the baby was fussing. Dad picks up the baby and holds him, looking at this little ravine by the path, and Mom goes to him, but she ends up stepping on loose soil and tripping. She falls for a dad who throws the kid, and he ends up falling 20 feet down this little ravine onto the rocks at the bottom. The father went down and picked up the child, but the child fell straight on his head and was dead by the time he got there. The child was only 15 months old. It was just a complete accident, a series of events that combined into the worst possible outcome. This is possibly one of the scariest calls I've ever been on, so I didn't see many animal bites while a SAR officer, mainly because there aren't many animals around. Although bears are present in the area, they tend to stay quite far from humans, and sightings are very unusual. Most of the animals you'll see are small, like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we see a lot are moose. And let me tell you, moose are nasty bastards. They will chase anything for any reason, and God help you if you get between a female and her young. One of the funniest calls I received was from a guy who was being chased by a very large male elk and got stuck in a tree. It took us almost an hour to get him down, and when he finally got back on solid ground, he looks at me and says, "Damn, those bastards are big up close." I guess it's not that bad, but we still laugh about it. I honestly don't know how I forgot this story, but it is definitely the worst thing that has happened to me here. I must have been trying to forget about it for so long that it didn't immediately occur to me. As someone who spends literally all of his time in the woods, you never want to let yourself be afraid of being alone or in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have these experiences, you tend to just forget about them and move on. But to date, this is the only thing that has made me seriously consider whether this job is right for me. I don't really like talking about it either, but I'll do my best to remember it all. As I recall, it happened just at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl wandered off her family's campsite and was missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were in utter despair and told us what most parents do. My child would never run away. She's so good at being around, she's never done anything like this before. We assure the parents that we will do everything we can to find her and are forming a standard search formation. I was partnered with one of my good friends and we kind of casually talked during the hike. I know it sounds callous, but you kind of get desensitized when you do it long enough. It's becoming the norm, and I think to some degree, you have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to do this job. Anyway, we've been looking for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where we thought she was, and into a small valley, when something made us both stop in unison. We freeze and look at each other, and it feels like the plane is depressurizing. My ears are popping, and I have the strange feeling that I've dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt it, but before I can, we hear the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. It's almost like a freight train passing right by us, but it's coming from all directions at the same time, including above and below us. He's yelling something at me, but I honestly can't hear him over the deafening roar. Understandably startled, we look around trying to find the source of the sound, but none of us can see anything. Of course, my first thought is a landslide, but we're nowhere near the cliffs. And even if there were, it would have already fallen on us. The sound goes on, and we are now trying to shout at each other. But even next to each other, we can't hear anything but this sound. And then, as suddenly as it starts, it stops. It's like someone flipped a switch and just turned it off. We stand for a second, completely still, and slowly the normal sounds of the forest return. He asks me what the hell just happened, but I just shrug, and we stand and just stare at each other for a minute. I turn on the radio and ask if anyone else has heard about the end of the world, but no one else does, even though we're all within shouting distance of each other. My friend and I just shrug and carry on. About an hour later, we all check the radio, and no one has found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't look for it when it gets dark, but since we don't have any sign of her, some of us decided to keep going, including me and my buddy. We stay close and call her every couple of minutes, and for now, I really hope we find her, because even though I don't like children, the thought of them being left alone in the dark is very terrifying. During the day, the forest can scare children, but at night, well, it's a whole different beast. But we see no sign of her and get no response, and around midnight we decide to turn around and head back to the rendezvous. We are about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines a light to our right on a very thick block or group of trees. I ask him if he heard the answer, but he just tells me to shut up for a second and listen. I do, and in the distance I hear what sounds like a baby crying. We both start calling the girl's name and listen for a response, but it's just a faint cry. We head in the direction of this dead drop and walk around it calling her name over and over, and as we get closer to crying, I start to get a weird feeling in my stomach, and I tell my buddy that something just isn't right. He tells me that he feels the same way too, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we were and say the girl's name again, and at the same time we both figure it out, crying on some loop. It's the same as a sharp sob, then a wail, then a quiet hiccup that repeats itself over and over. And every time the same thing, and without saying another word, we both just run. It's the only time I've ever lost my temper like this, but there was something very wrong about it, and neither of us wanted to stay there any longer. When we got back to the meeting place, we asked if anyone else had heard anything strange, but no one knew what we were talking about. I know this all sounds kind of drastic, but this call just blew me away for a long time. As for the girl, we never found any trace of her. Obviously, we've been following her for a while, and all the other people we've never found, but to be honest, I just doubt we'll ever find anything. Of all the missing person calls I've ever fielded, very few have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person or body has been found. But sometimes the search for a body raises more questions than answers. So here are some of the bodies we found that became infamous on our team. We once found a teenage boy whose remains were found almost a year after his disappearance. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and a camera nearly 45 miles from where he was last seen. Unfortunately, the camera was destroyed. We found the pelvis of an elderly man who went missing a month ago, and that's all we found. On the highest ridge in the southern part of the park, we found the lower jaw and right foot of a 2-year-old boy. We found the body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome nearly 20 miles from where she disappeared. She died of an infection 3 weeks after her disappearance, with all her clothing intact except for her shoes and jacket. Ironically, however, when the autopsy was performed, her stomach contained berries and cooked meat. The coroner said it appeared someone had been taking care of her, and no suspects were ever identified. We once found the frozen body of a 1-year-old that we found a week after it disappeared in a hollow tree trunk 10 miles from where it was last seen. There was fresh milk in his stomach, but no tongue. We also found a single vertebra and right patella of a 3-year-old girl. It was found in the snow, nearly 20 miles from the campsite where her family had been last summer. Now I want to share a couple of stories that my friend told me. I mentioned to him that you were all interested in the latter and that you were in luck. He had a close encounter with them, and while he doesn't have any explanations for them, he has a little more experience with them than I do. My buddy was a SAR officer for about 7 years, I think. He started when he was in college and had a very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him pretty much the same thing as mine, which was to never approach, touch, or climb them. He did so the first year, but apparently curiosity got the better of him. During one call, he got off the line and went to check on a few of them. He said they were about 10 miles from the trailhead where the teenage girl disappeared and dogs were searching for her. He was alone, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a ladder to his left. They looked like they were from a new house because the carpet was pristine and white. He said that when he got closer, he didn't feel anything different and didn't hear any strange noises. He kind of expected something to happen, like blood coming out of his ears or a fall, but he ended up right next to them and felt nothing. The only thing he said that was surprising was that there was absolutely no trash on the steps. No dirt, leaves, dust, or anything else, and there was no sign of animal or insect activity in the immediate area, which obviously struck him as odd. It was less like things were avoiding them, and more like they just ended up in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs and felt nothing but the sticky feeling you get from new carpet. Making sure his radio was on, he slowly climbed the stairs and said it was terrifying because they were stigmatized and he wasn't sure what was going to happen to him. He joked that half of him was waiting to be teleported to another dimension, and the other half was waiting for a UFO to come and pick him up. But he made it to the top with little incident, and he just stood there looking around. But he said the longer he stood on the top step, the more he felt he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as the feeling you get when you're in a part of a government building where you don't belong. As if at any second someone would come and arrest you or shoot you in the back of the head. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling grew stronger and stronger, and then he realized he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds of the forest had completely disappeared, and he could not hear his own breathing. It was like some strange and horrible tinnitus, but even more oppressive. He went down again and rejoined the search and did not mention to anyone what he had done. But he said the strangest thing happened next. His trainer was waiting at the reception center after the search was over for the day, and he cornered my friend before he could leave. He said his coach had a look of great anger and asked what was wrong. And he said to my buddy, "You climbed them, didn't you?" And it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how the trainer knew, and the trainer just shook his head. And then he said, "Because we didn't find her, the dogs lost her scent." My buddy asked what that had to do with anything, and the trainer asked how long he was on the stairs, and my buddy said no more than a minute. The coach looked at him with such terrible, almost dead eyes, and said that if he climbed the stairs again, he would be fired immediately. The coach just walked away, and I guess he never answered any of the questions my friend asked him since. My friend has also been involved in many missing person cases where no trace of them has been found. I mentioned David Pilati's story, and my buddy said he could confirm that those stories are mostly accurate. He said that in most cases, if a person is not found right away, they are either never found or are found weeks, months, or years later in places they simply couldn't get to. One story he told me really stood out, and it involved a 5-year-old boy with severe mental disabilities. A little boy disappeared from a picnic spot in the late fall. In addition to his mental disability, he was also physically disabled, and his parents explained over and over that he simply could not disappear, that it was impossible, that someone had to take him. My buddy said they had been searching for this kid for weeks, going miles away. But it felt as if he had never been there. The dogs couldn't pick up his scent anywhere, not even at the picnic spot where he apparently disappeared from. Suspicion eventually fell on the parents, but it was abundantly clear that they were devastated and had done nothing sinister to their child. The search was over after about a month, and my buddy said everyone pretty much forgot about it by the end of that winter. He was training later in the snow on one of the high peaks when he ran into something in the snow. He said that at first he saw it from a distance, and when he got closer he realized it was a shirt. Frozen and partially sticking out of the powder, he knew it belonged to that kid because it had a distinctive pattern on it. About 20 yards away, he found the child's body partially buried in the snow. My friend also said that the child had not been dead for more than a few days, even though he had been missing for almost 3 months. The baby was also curled up around something. And when my buddy brushed the snow away to see what it was, he said he could hardly believe what he was seeing. It was a large piece of ice that had been roughly carved to look like a man. The guy held him so hard that he froze his chest and hands, which my friend could tell even by the rotting that had occurred. He radioed the rest of the crew, and they removed the body from the mountain. Now he summed it all up for me and simply put, there is no way this baby could survive nearly 3 months on his own or reach that peak. There was just no physical way this kid could have walked nearly 50 miles and ended up on top of a damn mountain. And to top it off, there was nothing in the child's stomach or colon. Nothing. There is not even water. My buddy said it was like a baby had just been lifted off the face of the earth, suspended and dumped on this mountain a few months later, only to die of exposure. And he just never got over it. The next one I'm going to share from him was one that happened relatively recently, just a few months ago. So, they were going to scout for mountain lions because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. One of our jobs is to scout out places where we can see these animals to make sure that if they are in the area, we can alert people and close those trails. He was alone in a heavily wooded part of the park at dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman's scream in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, it sounds almost exactly like a woman being brutally murdered. This is alarming, but far from abnormal. My buddy called back on the walkie-talkie and told the security guard that he heard one and that he was going to keep walking to find out where his territory started. He heard the mountain lion cry several more times, always from the same place, and determined the approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another shout, this time only a few yards away. Of course, he freaked out. and started to come back at a much higher speed because the last thing he wants is to run into a damn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he got back on the trail and started walking back, he heard screams behind him, and he broke into a run. When he was about a mile from Ops, the yelling stopped, and he turned to see if he was being followed. It was almost night at this point, but he said that in the distance, just before the trail turned a corner, he saw what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning them that the paths were closed and that he needed to return to the reception center. But the figure just stood there, and my friend approached. When he was about 10 yards away, the figure took what he described as an incredibly long stride toward him and let out the same scream that my buddy heard. My friend obviously didn't say anything. He just turned and ran back to Ops without looking behind him. When he returned, the screams had moved into the forest, and he never mentioned it to anyone else, except to say that there was a mountain lion in the area, and they would have to close those trails until the animal was exterminated, placed and moved. So I will unfortunately have to end here, guys, as this has become quite long again. And I'm about to leave for my annual training session tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until at least early next week. I will be catching up with many former coaches and friends who work in other areas of the park, and will be asking about any stories they would like to share as well. I'm really glad you're interested in my stories, and once I get back from work, I'll be sure to continue sharing them. So until next time, guys. Hey guys, I'm back from training and I have a lot of really cool stories to share with you. I have enough that I'm going to break them into 2 parts. This is the first one. I'd like to put them all in one entry, but I haven't had a chance to record them all yet. I haven't had anything super crazy happen to me either, but we did have one incident with a newbie that I thought was kind of relevant. Since I'm sure you guys have been waiting for this, I'll just get down to the stories. I also assign each batch of stories to the person who told them to me. So I'll start with KD. KD is a vet who has been a SR officer for about 15 years, I think. She specializes in high-altitude mountain rescues and is considered one of the best in the field. She was one of the most enthusiastic storytellers, and since we were together quite a bit during the exercises, she ended up telling me about 4 that really stuck with me. The first thing she told me was in response to my question about her most traumatic calls. She shook her head and told me that really bad calls happen more often on the mountain because the chances of bad things happening are much higher. So about 5 years ago, a series of disappearances occurred in one of the parks where she worked. It was a bad year, she said, one of the worst on record for weather. They were getting about a foot of new snow every couple of days, and there were a few avalanches that killed some climbers as well. They warned people about being in the affected areas, but of course there are always those who don't listen. In one particular nasty case, an entire family was wiped out because the father decided he knew better than the officials and took them into the danger zone. They were snowshoeing, and as far as KD could tell, they were walking on a snow shelf that looked solid but wasn't. It gave way, and this family went en masse over the kettle almost 300 feet down the slope. They ended up on the rocks at the bottom, and the parents died instantly. One of the children did too, but the other 2 miraculously survived. One had a broken leg and fractured ribs, while the other was barely hurt except for bruises on a sprained ankle. The child, who was not hurt, left her brother and sister and went to find help. KD said the kid hadn't gone more than half a mile before the storm hit him too. The child stopped and tried to warm up, or maybe just rest, and ended up freezing to death. They ended up finding the family with the help of several witnesses who saw them heading into the desert, and it was she who found the child who had frozen to death in search of help. She said that it had just started to snow, enough to obscure vision in the distance, but not enough to make searching impossible. And she saw a figure just sitting in the snow ahead, and went to it as fast as she could. She described in detail how, as she got closer, she realized first that it was a child, second, that they were dead, and third, that they were frozen in one of the most miserable positions she had ever seen. Found a corpse. The guy was sitting straight, his knees pressed to his chest, his arms around them, and his head tucked into his coat. When she pulled back her coat to look at his face, she saw that he had died crying. His face was crooked, and tears froze on his cheeks. She said it was painfully obvious the baby was terrified as he succumbed to hypothermia, and as a mother, it broke her heart. She has repeatedly told me that she hopes her father is burning in hell as we speak. Another traumatic story she told me that stood out, at least in my mind, was one that happened when she was a novice. Her team received a report about an experienced climber who had not returned home the day before. His wife was convinced something bad had happened because he never came home on time. They went looking for him and had to climb what sounded like very technically challenging parts of the mountain. They were on relatively level ground, and KD began to see blood on the snow. She followed the trail and, she said, began to see pieces of cloth. She didn't know exactly which part of her body it came from, but the further she followed him, the more it became. She follows the blood in the trail of cloth to a sheltered spot under the rock and finds the climber. She said there was so much blood, more than she had ever really seen before, and he was lying face down with one arm out in front of him, crawling to death. She takes a closer look and sees that it has been partially etched, which is where the fabric she saw came from. The guy has an ice axe hidden in a hip holster, and he's also covered in blood. Of course, they'll never be sure what happened, but she said the best she could figure out was what happened. The guy was trying to get up to the next area and used his ice axe to get up, and he probably hit an open area and fell, and on the way down, or maybe when he landed, he got impaled by an axe stake and it vaporized his guts. He dragged himself, tearing out pieces of himself as he went, and died under the cliff. She's not too bothered by the blood, but I guess the few guys who came over to help her get the body out were alarmed when they turned him over, and a good portion of his intestines spilled out. I also mentioned to her that I was interested in hearing about any experiences she's had with people disappearing completely. And when I said that, her eyes lit up, and she leaned into me. She told me I wanted to hear a real doozy, and she tells me about how when she first started, there was one case that got a lot of media attention. A family was picking berries in a wooded area near the entrance to the park. They had 2 little boys, both under the age of 5, and at some point during the day, one of them just disappears. There is an absolutely massive search, but they find nothing. This is another one of those cases where the baby was just never there. Dogs just sit and do not take anything. No traces of the child were found either. The search lasted for about 2 months, but was eventually stopped. 6 months later, the family returns to lay flowers at the memorial set up for the child. They bring the other son, and while they are laying the flowers, they lose sight of the child for about 3 seconds, during which time he simply vanishes into thin air. Now obviously the parents are beyond devastated. Losing one child is terrible enough, but losing 2 is unimaginable. The search is huge, one of the largest in the state's history, with about 300 volunteers combing every inch of this park looking for this child. But again, there is simply no sign of him. The search has been going on for about a week, with people searching miles away from the part of the park where he disappeared. And then, nearly 2 weeks later, a volunteer, nearly 15 miles from the designated search area, reported finding the child. They believe the baby is dead, but a volunteer says he's not only alive, he's in good shape. Katie and her team go to find the baby, and when they get there, she can't believe that this baby is missing. His clothes are clean, there's no dirt anywhere on him, and he doesn't look injured. A volunteer says he found a child sitting on a log playing with a bunch of twigs tied with old rope. Kathy obviously asks him where he's been and who he's been with these 2 weeks, and the kid tells her he's been with the furry man. KD is now a firm believer in Bigfoot, so she's excited and asks what he means by fuzzy. Was he hairy or something? But the kid says no, he wasn't hairy. He was a furry person. And he describes the person as blurred, like when you close your eyes, but not all the way. He says that the man came out from behind the trees and took the child with him deep into the forest. And the child says that he slept in the hollow of the tree, and the fluffy man gave him berries to eat. Kathy asks if the man was mean, and if he scared the kid, and the kid says no, he wasn't scary at all. But then he said, I don't like that he doesn't have eyes. KD says they're taking the kid back to HQ, and the cop is taking him into town to talk to him about what happened. She's friends with the police officer who spoke to him, and she said the child described being kept in this tree by a furry man and given berries whenever he was hungry. He was allowed to roam in a special clearing, but when he tried to go further, the furry man became angry and screamed very loudly, even though he had no mouth. When the child was frightened at night, the furry man enlightened him and gave him a bunch of twigs. He said that this furry man was going to hold him, but he had to let him go because the baby wasn't the right kind, and he either can't or doesn't want to talk about it in detail. The cops are just scratching their heads, to be honest, and the search for his brother resumes with no results. The boy has no idea where his brother might be, and to this day, he has never been found. The last story KD told me was about what happened to her when she was separated from her training group when she was a rookie. They were learning the basics of high-altitude insurance on a map of the world where the mountain is, and she had to use the bathroom. During her lunch break, she moved about 50 yards away from the group and minded her own business. I will tell the rest exactly as she told me. So I go pee, and once I'm done, I start walking back to the group. But I only got about 5 feet when I realized I had no idea where I was, and it wasn't, I turned around and got lost. I mean, I literally had no idea where I was. If you asked me, I don't even think I could tell you the state we're in. I think that's kind of how people with amnesia feel, you know? You are completely lost and have no idea what to do, so I just stood there for a while, just trying to figure out what I was and what I should do. But the longer I stand there, the more confused I become, so I started walking. As far as I can remember, I just picked a random direction and went in it, and as I go, it gets worse and worse, to the point where I don't understand why I'm on the mountain at all. I walk through the snow and then I hear this voice. The strange thing was that it was in my head, almost as if the frog could talk, low and croaking, and it kept telling me over and over that it's okay. You just need to find something to eat, and you'll be fine. Just keep walking and find something to eat, eat. So I start looking for anything to eat, and I swear to God, I've never been so hungry in my life. It was bottomless, and I think I would have eaten pretty much anything you put in front of me at that point. I had no concept of time, so I didn't know how long I had been there when I heard a real voice coming towards me. I walk up to him and see one of the other SARs, and he looks horrified. He runs to me, asking if I'm okay and what the hell I'm doing here. And the worst thing was that when he ran towards me, I could see myself reaching for my hunting knife in my belt. I don't even think about what I'm doing, but I think I have to eat, and if I don't eat, I'll never be okay, so I just have to eat. He sees me doing this and immediately backs away. He yells at me to put the knife down and that he won't hurt me, and it kind of rips me off in response. Suddenly, I know exactly where I am and put the knife down. I run up to him and ask him how long I've been gone, thinking he's going to tell me I've been gone half an hour or so, but he tells me I've been gone for 2 freaking days. I got over 2 peaks and was almost on the other side of the mountain, and if I kept going, I would end up wandering about 300 miles of desert, and there is no way they would ever find me there. He can't believe I'm not dead, of course, and I don't know what the hell to think. No time has passed for me at all, and I just don't say anything. I just go back to his meeting place, and I'm taken back to headquarters to be taken by helicopter to the hospital. When I get there, they are doing all kinds of tests and trying to figure out what happened. As far as they can guess, I've had some kind of weird amnesia-like condition or a freak seizure that's thrown my brain out of whack. But the truth is, we just don't know. I mean, it never happened again, but I'll tell you, I've never gone there alone since. People get mad at me for making them come with me when I have to leave the group. But I just tell them I'd rather listen to myself plowing into the snow than lose myself for 2 freaking days on a frozen mountain. So the next person I spoke to was E.W., a former coach who now works as a therapist. He still comes to surgeries like this to help out, but no longer works for us full-time. He specialized in finding lost children and seemed to have a 6th sense for knowing when they were missing. He really is a legend among senior vets, but he gets embarrassed when you compliment him on his work. So he sat down with me for dinner one night and we ended up exchanging some stories. Most of them were just random. But then we got on the topic of our weirder calls, and I mentioned that I had a friend who was climbing the stairs. When I said this, he stopped and asked me if I had heard of the little boy who disappeared from this park a few years ago. I hadn't, so he told me this story. So they were looking for this 11-year-old boy, Joey, who had gone missing near the river. Of course, the first thought was that he had fallen and drowned, but when they got the dogs out, they led the SR officers away from the river and into a very dense forest. When we do a people search, we search in a grid pattern, and we search every grid field incredibly carefully. What the EW team noticed right away was that a very strange pattern was emerging. The dogs in the alternating boxes picked up Joey's scent, but lost it when the other box was covered. If you can imagine a checkerboard, Joey's flavor was detected in a random black square, but never in a red one. Of course, that didn't make any sense, because how could this kid just jump from neighborhood to neighborhood without leaving a scent in every place he passed through? EW and its partner moved to a new network box, and the EU spots a ladder about 50 yards away. He tells his partner that they need to go and check nearby, but his partner just refuses. He tells EW that he's made it a point to never go near the gatherings he sees, and that while it might be commonplace, he shouldn't pretend it's normal. He tells EW he'll be waiting in plain sight while EW checks. EW says he was annoyed, but he also sympathized with the guy and didn't push him on the subject. Here's what he said. "I walked up to the stairs and it was small, like a basement staircase, and I don't feel very much about it in any part. I mean, it's just a ladder, so I wasn't scared or anything. I'm probably like everyone else and just pretend I don't think about them too much. But in any case, I approached and saw that something was lying on the bottom step, curled up in a ball. My heart sings because of course you always hope for the best, and we were sure we would find this child alive because he had only been missing for a few hours. But I immediately realized that it was him and that he was definitely dead. He was curled up on the footstool holding his stomach, and it looked like he was in terrible pain as he died. But I saw no blood except blood on his lips and chin. I radioed that I had found him and that we needed to return his body to the commander. It was a very horrible sight. I was never the same after that,